what I have for you today. I have a special treat. Nom nom nom. Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and if your garden is anything like mine, you have Japanese beetles. And if you have Japanese beetles, you know how annoying and destructive they can be. Now, normally, I don't really do too much about pests. You guys know I've done videos on this before of what we do for them, but I get the question a lot of what do you do for aphids, what do you do for grasshoppers, etc., etc. Usually my answer is the same, which is build ecosystem support so that you have lots of biodiversity, you have lots of great beneficial insects. This whole area behind me is a great example of an ecosystem support area in the garden that we grow specifically to help attract beneficial insects, to help balance out our ecosystem. Over here in the woods, we have another piece of that, which is all of the things that we plant and have going just specifically to provide bird habitat, to provide food and forage for birds. And by doing that, we're also building a lot of pest resistance into the garden. So we have things like these American plums. We also have plenty of choke cherries over here. And every morning I see tons of birds out enjoying these. And by growing these things here in the garden, we're getting lots of birds to our space. So that's kind of typically why when I get that question of what do you do for this pest or that pest, usually my answer is the same, which is I build up the ecosystem. I make sure I'm supporting birds and attracting native beneficial insects. However, Japanese beetles are an exception to this because Japanese beetles and lanternflies are another example of this. Japanese beetles are non-native to my area, to North America. And so they've really only been around for maybe 50 or so years. I'm not exactly sure, don't quote me on that. Point is that they're not something that has co-evolved with our native ecosystems. So they don't have a ton of predators yet. While there are some birds that will consume Japanese beetles, in my experience, they don't really like them that much. They're a really readily available food source, and yet I don't tend to see a lot of birds, at least in my area, eating them. And again, they just haven't evolved to eat them. So this kind of explains why these Japanese beetles have become a problem, because there really isn't much that we can do for them in terms of ecosystem support. Let me show you what I've gathered this morning. You might know that roses tend to be a primary target of these Japanese beetles, and so often you'll find them on roses. You'll also find them on grapevines, on hops, on Virginia creeper, which no, it's not invasive in most of North America. It's aggressive, but not invasive. Let's just remember that. Virginia creeper can actually be a really beneficial ecosystem plant for our birds, but that's a whole different topic for another time. The point is, they like a lot of the garden plants that I also like, and I don't necessarily want them eating. So let's start by going over a few myths and things that don't work for Japanese beetles, and then we'll go over a few things that do work for Japanese beetles. Okay, so first let's talk about a couple of things that don't work for Japanese beetles. Number one is the traps. The Japanese beetle traps are pheromone based. That means they contain the pheromone that attracts Japanese beetles. So they will smell this, it's quite potent, they will smell it and they flock to your area. The downside of this is that it attracts a lot of Japanese beetles to your area, but they don't all usually end up in the trap. In fact, many of them, the majority, don't end up in the trap. So what you're doing is you're attracting them to your area, but not necessarily trapping them. Now, there are situations in which the bags might help. For example, there's a town in Colorado called Palisade where they actually put a bunch of Japanese beetle traps. Every house put them up, and that situation, they might actually work because their quantity of traps is enough to also trap the amount of beetles they are attracting. And if you can trap them all, that's great. It takes everybody participating. So that may be a situation where the traps could work. Or if you have a particularly large lot, say you have a farm and you have 5 acres, you could put one way on the other end of your place and let all the Japanese beetles be attracted to that end. But remember, Japanese beetles can fly for up to 10 to 15 miles from where they are hatched as a grub. So don't necessarily count too much on just because you caught all the ones in your yard means they're gone. That's just not how Japanese beetles work, unfortunately. The second thing that I have heard that is a really interesting concept, but I have never personally found it to work, is geraniums. Growing geraniums, and the story is that the Japanese beetles will eat the geraniums and it paralyzes them, and then they fall to the ground and can't eat, so they die. We grew an entire 40-foot row of geraniums the last 2 years, and right next to our dahlias, and still they didn't touch the geraniums. They much preferred the dahlias, and we never saw benefits or effects from geranium. However, we were growing only a couple varieties of geranium, and it's possible that there is another type of geranium that does work. So if you have found that to be the case, please feel free to share it below in the comments so we can all hear about it. Now, the third thing that really might work, but I highly would not recommend in the regenerative garden, or in any garden for that matter, is the pesticides intended to target Japanese beetles. Now, neem oil typically does not work on hard-bodied insects like Japanese beetles, so don't even start down that road. And neem oil really doesn't work that well in general, and also it has lots of side effects, especially for example, bumblebees. So I don't advise using neem oil, but definitely not in the case of hard-bodied insects like Japanese beetles. There are some products out there on the market that will work, but they have the side effect of killing absolutely everything that visits that plant. So for example, a company that rhymes with Schmeyer makes a product called 3-in-1 Rose Feed. And it sounds like it's just a food for your roses, but also what it does is it kills, it's a neonicotinoid, and it is a systemic pesticide that resides in the tissue and roots of the plant. It's really kind of unclear how long it resides in the tissue of the plant, and it also has to do with the type of plant. So woodier plants, it can hang around longer than, say, annual plants, but in general, usually those neonicotinoids stay in the system of the plant for at least 1 season and up to 3, 4, 5 years. So don't recommend treating your plants with those systemic pesticides that are actually going to work for Japanese beetles, because it will also kill every beneficial, every bee. You're going to actually end up creating more long-term issues and dependence on those products in your garden if you use them, versus if you just try some other alternatives. So those are 3 things that either don't work or highly not recommended to try to get rid of Japanese beetles. But let's talk about some things that might work. And I'm gonna go sit by my tomatoes because you have to see how big they are. I feel like tomatoes is always like the show off thing in the garden, you know? Like, look how big my tomatoes are. Look how big my tomatoes are. They are huge. Okay, so some things that work. Let's start with the ones that you've probably already heard. 1, scooping your Japanese beetles in the morning or in the evening into a container with soapy water. This is the easiest and most basic way to control the adult versions and to help try to hopefully keep them from laying more eggs in your soil, thus producing more grubs, thus producing more Japanese beetles. If all of us could do our part in helping control the adult populations just by hand scooping into water, that would be really helpful. So that's something you can do if you have a lot of plants like I do. I'll often use a little handheld vacuum to suck them into a canister, and then I'll feed them to my chickens. I'll freeze them and just give them to my chickens. That usually works. And it's a quicker way if you have a lot of plants like I do, but if you're doing it on roses, for example, sometimes we can suck off the rose petals too. So, you know, use your judgment if you have a lot of plants to treat. Another way that you can help reduce your amount of Japanese beetles is by reducing how much irrigated sod you have in your lawn. Now, we've talked about reducing the lawn as a theory overall and how that is better for our ecosystem. It's a better use of water, all of those things we had discussed before. But another benefit of getting rid of specifically irrigated sod is that irrigated sod is Japanese beetles' preferred place to survive and thrive as grubs, because there's lots of food via the roots of the plants as grubs. It's nice and wet, so actually they prefer moist irrigated areas over maybe, for example, drier areas like our lavender field or our native grass areas where we don't have to give supplemental water. I have actually found that as we've been cutting the amount of grass that we had here at this property when we moved in, we've reduced our Japanese beetle population because they don't like our drought tolerant plants. But if you're somewhere that's already naturally moist, that advice isn't going to work out all that well for you. But the more irrigated, non-native Kentucky bluegrass lawns we have, the more Japanese beetle grubs we're going to have too. Now, we mentioned that Japanese beetles are non-native, and so they don't tend to have a ton of predators, but they do have some predators. And the predators that we are starting to see with Japanese beetles are parasitic wasps. So parasitic wasps you might be familiar with because they tend to lay eggs on, for example, the tomato hornworm. And you'll see those green tomato hornworms and they have all those little eggs on their backs. That's a good thing. You want to let those little eggs grow and hatch because it will create more parasitic wasps that will help balance out your ecosystem of your garden. Now, that being said, it's not every wasp that uses a Japanese beetle as a host. There are a couple specific ones, and one that I want to highlight is the blue-winged wasp. As I mentioned earlier in the video, growing a lot of native plants can really help to bolster your ecosystem in your garden and minimize how much you're having to use pesticides in general. So in this instance, plants like solidago and mountain mint, which are North American natives, can attract these blue-winged wasps that use the Japanese beetle as a host. So again, we see the benefits of growing more native plants in the garden and a wider variety of native plants in the garden as well. So that will, over time, help reduce your populations of Japanese beetles. I will say that goldenrod can spread. And so if you don't want it spreading, what I always recommend doing is just deadheading it. Once it's done blooming, just cut it on down and don't let it flower and don't let it go to seed, and that will help control. But we did plant these ones. We have actually quite a few. You can see these are all goldenrods down here, and we have a whole row of these solid aster, which are kind of a hybrid of solidago and aster, and you can see how popular this one is with the honeybees, certainly. Not so much with the bumblebees, though I do see a leaf cutter and I see a mason bee in here. I do see a couple little native pollinators up in here. Let's just take a look real quick at some dahlias just because we're right here. Oh, hello you. Look at you, you are so cute. It's one of my favorites here. They're quite tall this year. These are the overwintered dahlias. All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. All right, so the last thing that I wanted to mention that you can try to help with the Japanese beetle population is something called Milky Spore. Now, Milky Spore is a bacteria that specifically targets Japanese beetle grubs. So it will not really help with existing adult populations. It is really meant for the grub stage. It comes in a powder form that you apply directly to the soil. You sprinkle it on the soil. Ideally, you're going to want to do it in spring or in fall, and preferably right before a rainfall event. But that soil bacteria will help over time reduce the amount of grubs in your lawn. Now, it's not perfect. It's not going to kill all of them. I'd say maybe expect for that Milky Spore to work on about 50% of the grubs in your soil, and that's best case scenario. But it will help. It is quite expensive, and it would be most helpful if you can get all of your neighbors and the people around you to also apply it. So if you can, my suggestion is to buy a big bag of Milky Spore in the fall, divvy it up amongst your neighbors, and everybody apply it. So there it is, my tips and tricks on Japanese beetles. Now, if we could really get everyone doing those 4 things, so hand scooping the adults into soapy water, applying Milky Spore, everyone doing it, planting more beneficial insect attracting native plants and more biodiversity, and reducing the amount of irrigated non-native sod lawn grass, those things would help a lot with Japanese beetles. But that being said, we've done all of those things, and we are still, of course, subject to whatever's happening around us. So we don't exist in a vacuum. We are only 1.5 acres, and so whatever our neighbors are doing also impacts us, or what they're not doing too. So it really takes a lot of people working together to try to combat these non-native pests. But that doesn't mean we should give up. You might remember a video from last fall where I mentioned that I was probably taking out a lot of our roses. I actually never got around to it this spring. We were so busy with the house project. And so we still do have roses, and I still do have Japanese beetles, even though I grow lots of native things. We do trap cropping because we have Virginia creeper way out in the woods, and we let the Japanese beetles try to go there instead of to our roses, but try telling nature what to do, right? We still have Japanese beetles on our roses, and we've tried a couple other things, including growing a lot of, this is all the garlic that we just harvested from in and amongst these roses. We were hoping that the alliums would help cut back the amount of Japanese beetles, and unfortunately that did not really seem to be the case. I don't find that they're really that much reduced over previous years. And we still have some walking onions in here too. What I have been doing is kind of cutting them back, and I cut them up and then I just kind of toss them in amongst the roses just to see if the smell kind of helps, but it doesn't really seem to do any major impact in terms of helping keep them away. So if they're really driving you crazy, you might just consider kind of cutting out a lot of those plants that they seem to be attracted to in your garden and save yourself the headache, because I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. All right guys, that was it from the farm. Stay tuned this weekend. We are going to do our best to get a shoot done of the entire farm because it is in peak bloom almost. Our Lysianthus are so close. And I want you guys to share and see that. So if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe so you get all of our notifications. Don't forget to like and, you know, tell your friends, I guess. I've got all these roses deadheaded. This is the other thing I like to do, is regularly deadhead all of my roses during this Japanese beetle season, because, and one of the things that I like to do is just to deadhead my roses regularly during this time of year, so that once the Japanese beetle season is over, hopefully coming out soon here, mid-September, we'll at least get one good flush of roses. So I do keep my roses well deadheaded, especially if they seem to be being attacked by these guys. So that's it. I'm gonna go give these rose deadheads to Midnight and Roosevelt because I love these roses, and I will see you guys around here next time at the farm.